Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Today is September 17th, 2024, and our class today is going to be on Belarus, or Belarus, the last Soviet Republic. As always, a few reminders. The People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies is a Party of Communist USA sponsored school, so this does allow us to have a wide range of views and discussions. So for tonight, we'll be discussing the pre-socialist Belarus, the Belarus SSR, the post-counter-revolution Belarus, and debunking a couple of Western myths about Belarus. So our first section tonight is going to be prehistory and geography of Belarus.
All right. And we have there a map of Belarus right there. And it says, per Anna Louisa Strong's People of the USSR, Belarus is about the size of Minnesota, contains about 9 million people. The largest city is Minsk, and the Neman or Pripyat and Dnieper rivers flow through. A good portion of the country is marshland. So some pre-Soviet Belarus history is from the earliest days of the Slavs, the people between the marshes were separate principalities who joined the other Slavs for purposes of war. They took part in the famous campaign of Kiev Rus against Constantinople and shared in the loot. The Mongol invasion that burned Kiev in 1240 or 1240 was halted by the marshes. The people between the marshes remain free. Some authorities hold that the name Byelorussian, White Russian, comes from that period and was used to describe their independence from Mongol rule. The word white has a secondary meaning for free. Others hold that it came from their long, whitish clothing, homespun from their flax. Still others think that it was given because they were more blonde than other Russians, who had an admixture of Finnish blood, or more so than the Ukrainians, who had intermarried the Mongols and Turks. That was from Anna Louisa Strong, People of the USSR. And some more pre-Soviet Belarus history. All this was sharply changed by the royal marriage that united Lithuania and Poland in 1569. One of the terms of the marriage was that the Lithuanian king and all his subjects should embrace Roman Catholicism, the faith of the Poles. The White Russian peasants stuck to their own religion in spite of bishop, pope, or king. They had received the Orthodox variety of Christianity straight from Holy Kiev, which had it from the Eastern Empire and the Old Greek Church. The men of the marshes were a stubborn folk. They had fought that Polish religion from 1569 down to the present day. And that was also from Anna Louisa Strong, People of the USSR. And we see a map there. Yep. And moving on to pre-Soviet Belarus still. By 1900, Belarus was still largely a rural society. Industrialization was slow across most of Russia, but particularly in Belarus. Some urban development had taken place, with the large towns and cities becoming busy centers of trade. Jews became the majority ethnic group within Belarusian cities, with Yiddish being the most spoken language. The underdeveloped nature of the Belarusian land and economy meant that cooperation and bartering were essential for survival. Though the type of work was ethnically divided, the Belarusians and the Jews were inextricably tied. The Belarusians primarily worked the land and sold or exchanged their produce for the clothes, boots, and etc. that the Jews manufactured. And the importance of this was notable, particularly when the Nazis occupied Belarus in 1941 when they found litid anti-Semitism, and
Little,
indeed,
sorry.
yeah, thank you, and indeed great resistance to their policies. With one German officer reporting that the people of Belarus actually considered the Jews to be as much of a human being as the Belarusians. And so that was by Stuart Parker's The Last Soviet Republic. And there's a picture of it right there.
We will now go to our first discussion round.
Thank you. I couldn't help but catch there from the Anna Louise Strong work that the Belarusians, one of the reasons they were called white Russians was because, unlike the Ukrainians, they didn't mix with the Mongols. And, compare that to now, one of the rallying cries of the Ukrainian nationalists against the Russians is that, unlike the Russians, they're not mixed with Mongol blood. And they view themselves as the pure Slavs because of that. So that shows you what a farce that is right there.
Indeed. Great point there. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm a little bit ignorant as towards the differences between Orthodox Christianity and regular Christianity. Can anyone kind of give a brief explanation of some of the differences and why that's been such a contentious thing whenever we talk about Russia versus the rest of like Christian Europe?
So the brief overview I can give, and probably others can expound on it, is at one time you had the Universal Catholic Church, or what the word Catholic means is basically universal. And then 1453, you had the church split, or the Great Schism between the Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox. And part of this was what center was considered to be the central location of Christianity? Was it Constantinople, which later shifted to Greece, and then later to Kiev as those lands fell to the Ottoman empires, and then later to Moscow? Or was it Rome, who had been part of the Eastern Roman Empire and then later had its own ascendancy? And that's kind of the split with that. But I see some other hands went up on that question. Comrade Angelo, did you want to respond?
Yeah, in one sentence, the Roman Catholics see the Pope as their jurisdiction. The Orthodox have different ones. In other words, in the Ukraine, the Orthodox Church is one bishop that leads them, and in Russia, it's another one, and in Greece, it's another one. And that's one of the differences that I know. But everything you said, Cameron, was correct. And when the Romans controlled that area, Constantinople was called Byzantium. So therefore, that was called the Byzantine Empire because of that. But that was correct. Thank you.
Simply put, the primary difference between the East and Western Church is the concept of whether you do Latin rites or Greek rites. There's some other minor differences like whether you use leavened or unleavened bread. And it also primarily delves between the concept of having a first among equals, or, the patriarchs of the different churches, and maintaining their districts, versus having a head of state over the entire church, which is what the Pope is. So, differences on theological and ecclesiastical stuff.
Yeah, thank you. And so in the context of today's class, and between Byelorussian, Ukraine, Poland, we have on the YouTube channel for the People's School a video from Barry Latucci, Professor Latucci, who gave a presentation at the Left Forum, and I think it's 2015, so it's almost 10 years ago. But he goes very much into the history of the region, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. It's sort of medieval / Renaissance politics is what it is, and it was created, at least in his presentation, it explains why it was created by the Polish gentry who conquered that area to tear away what was like the Greek, or not Greek, but the Orthodox Christian. It's sort of a political power play between East and West, if you will, in that specific region. And it's old school politics is what that is. And Barry Latucci explains it in his video. It's part 1 or part 2 of a video series that People School did on fascism in Ukraine. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's probably not much time left for it here, but on YouTube, there's a channel called Bible Illustrated that has a good video detailing how the Eastern Orthodox Church differs from other Christian faiths. Also, it's worth noting that Ukraine has recently outright banned the Eastern Orthodox Church. They still have the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but that is a completely separate entity from the Eastern Orthodox Communion that the Antioch Greek and Russian Orthodox churches are opposed.
So there was a lot of history, I guess, of what is now Ukraine. And it seems that the Belarusian, I guess, identity was really pitted against, I would say, to distinguish itself against the Ukrainian one. And, that was like I said, that's the first time I read that. And it sounds like religion had a huge factor in that. But also there was it seemed like there were a lot of Jewish people that were speaking Yiddish as well. Was that really just if you were Jewish, would you just find yourself in Belarusian society? Was it just more applicable, like it was saying? There was kind of yeah.
So there was actually a bit I was not able to get in, but Catherine the Great in, I believe, around 1600 had declared the Pale, or a area of land where Jews were permitted to live within the Russian Empire, and a lot of Belarus fell within that area. So there was a forced mass deportation of Jews from other areas of the Russian Empire into this area. But they were able at least to find that, okay, so in the cities, at least with these trades, we can do that, while there are still the peasants around the areas that still kind of rely on the goods and services we can produce. And so it kind of became, it was a survival, because most of Belarus was marshlands that in the spring, when it flooded, you could maybe get around, but summer, fall, all the hamlets were really isolated with each other. But come the winter, however, when everything froze over, then there was a lot of back and forth traveling and communicating, and a lot of trade going on then. So winter was always the larger time when a lot of trade went on in Belarus, because the swamps were frozen and people could actually get to other places in the region.
Thank you for that answer. Real quick. And so when we talked about that, it really, was I wrong? Like, it looked like Ukraine went more with a Catholic side of things.
So Ukraine was, for the most part, always carved up between either the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire that was coming from the western side, you had parts of it that were under the Mongol invasion at one point. So there was a lot of different cultures and factors going on, and there was a lot of penetration of different Roman Catholic groups in that area to try to convert a lot of people away from the Orthodox Christianity, and that also exacerbated tensions around that area. But the marshes and Belarus area, because it was marshy, that the horses of the Golden Horde did not really go there because it was not really suitable for that. So they kind of kept their own little identity. And even though they've been ruled by the Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Russian Empire, they still kind of, because they were these isolated hamlets mostly with some large cities in the areas, they still mostly kept their identity throughout history.
Comrade, you pretty much nailed it all. But yeah, and I think earlier it was mentioned how there's a new Orthodox Church. So that's the old one is the Orthodox Christian Church or whatever, and then the new one of Ukraine, and the new one is it has like a different name. It's just they spelled the thing differently. Now it's like basically the NATO-controlled Orthodox Church. But the Orthodox Church is separate from that Greek Catholic Ukrainian Church, which is the one mentioned earlier that I was saying. And it's more than just the Polish. The reason it still exists today is it also became a Habsburg project. I know we forget about that group of people, but there was the German Empire, then there was also Austria-Hungary. And it's basically a certain region of modern-day Ukraine which was taken by the Soviet Union actually during war. That western region is really the heartland of the Catholic part in Ukraine.
Some theological differences between Eastern Orthodox and Catholic that weren't brought up were Eastern Orthodox rejects the ideas of penal substitution, original sin, and hell as a literal underworld of fire. Also, unlike Protestant Christianity, both Orthodox and Catholics have more comprehensive Bibles that include what most Americans would call the Apocrypha.
The Apocrypha? You were cutting off there. Okay. All right. If there are no more comments or questions, we will move on to our second section for tonight, which is going to be discussing the Belarus SSR.
Okay, the Byelorussian SSR. On the day when Lenin took power in St. Petersburg on November 7th, 1917, a group of working men in Minsk proclaimed a Soviet government for White Russia, which is Belarus. Peasants began to divide the nobles' estates, but this early government had a short life because the Germans advanced into this territory. However, they were driven out, and on January 1st, 1919, White Russia became a separate Soviet republic. The Belarusian SSR, along with the Ukrainian SSR, the Russian Federative Socialist Soviet Republic, and the Transcaucasian SSR, were the four SSRs that formed the Soviet Union in 1922.
And I have the map spelling. Yep, I'm sorry. And yeah, Belarus is this little tiny republic right here.
20 million acres of land in Soviet White Russia that had belonged to the Tsar, the nobles, and the monasteries were distributed at once to the peasants and the farmhands who were tilling it. When added to the 15 million acres the peasants already possessed, this gave them more than twice as much as before. The new land was much better and more conveniently located. During the next 10 years, the peasants organized cooperative farms with the help of government credits and machines. The cultivated area rapidly increased from 6.25 million acres to 10 million acres by 1937. Nearly 9,000 tractors and thousands of harvester combines, potato seeders, and cultivators were used in the cooperative fields. The harvest yield doubled, giving the people 4 times as much food as before. The change in the rural districts can be shown from 2 villages.
Mokhod is a village in the southern marshes. Its name means moss eater. Its people actually ate moss, as did those of many of the poorer villages. The nearby meadows and cultivated lands belonged to the Lord. The peasants owned some swampy woodland 8 to 10 miles away. Here, they dried the moss, collected acorns, and mixed the two with chaff from the landlord's rye. Thus, they made bread. The village suffered from all kinds of epidemics and seemed constantly on the point of dying out. Then a cooperative farm was formed. By 1938, Mokhod was thriving. The cooperative farmers produced good food on the former landlord's estate, but the chief income came from the 2 new sawmills established during the 5-year plans. There was a hospital in the village and a clubhouse with motion pictures. There were 5 schools in its scattered hamlets. There were radios in most of the homes. The birth rate shows the improvement. In 1934, 17 babies were born. In 1937, about 100. Dashkova lies in the better lands. It was a typical White Russian farm region. The peasants farmed tiny strips surrounded by a large area of land belonging to the Lord. The priest wrote most of the letters for the villagers, few of whom could read and write. There was a parish school for 40 pupils. It had 3 grades and taught a little reading and writing and the catechism to the children of the better-off peasants. In the stagnant life, most of them soon forgot the little they learned. For centuries, not a single villager ever became anything but a farm laborer or a shepherd. Today, everyone in Dashkova can read and write. There are evening schools and a township high school with more than 400 pupils. Young folks go away to college on scholarships. The village has already produced from its children 8 teachers, 7 doctors, 5 lieutenants of the Red Army, 2 engineers, a pilot, an agronomist, a diplomat, and dozens of tractor drivers and mechanics. It is pleasant when twilight falls on the wide meadows of the cooperative farm to stand on the nearest hillock or old burial mound and watch the lights come on in the farm buildings. The windows of homes, of evening schools, of the club building and the stables are bright with electric light. You hear the sound of old songs and new songs. Some of the new songs have a pleasant humor. And this is also from Anna Louise Strong's People of the USSR. You have a peat machine at work in a rural area here on the left, and a view of the new government buildings in Minsk. And this was pre-World War II, Great Patriotic War, so.
White Russia's good fortune comes today directly from its swamps. More than 2 million acres of them have been drained under Soviet rule. Some of this area makes good farmland. The rest of it makes good peat supply. This is important wealth. Peat is good fuel. Peat is also good fertilizer, especially for sandy soil. Many important industrial chemicals are obtained from peat. The 2 curses of the White Russian farmlands are the peat swamps and the sandy hillocks. These 2 worst soils were mixed together and very good soil was secured. The fine, long flax of White Russia grows well on such soil. White Russian flax is exported and is famous throughout the world. Electric power stations were built near the peat swamps, using the peat for fuel. Some cooperative farms even had their own electric power plant in their own swamp. Large power stations supplied the 2,000 new industrial establishments that were built in White Russia from 1928 to 1937, the years of the 2 5-year plans. By 1939, White Russia was producing from its swamps nearly 500,000 kilowatt hours of energy, more than 100 times as much electricity as the area had in 1913. The swamps that were once the source of misery and poverty had become the source of light and power.
Thank you, Comrade General Secretary Joe. We'll now go to our second discussion round.
Sort of response to the electric power station. Anyways, so what's interesting is you see that with the introduction of a rise in living standards, quite contrary, all of this stuff happened under socialism, not capitalism. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. And a lot of those power stations, as well mentioned, were hydroelectric because all the swamps had those 3 rivers that drained into them, and they used those to make hydroelectric power plants.
Yeah, you said like the thing we just read said like it said like they produce power from hydroelectric plants. Did it say anything else about power generation, or remember like talk about power being produced?
So peat is a lot of the material they used as well. Peat is a very dense organic material kind of found in swamps. There's a lot of different layers of dead plant material and other stuff that kind of overlap each other, and you can actually use that as a source of fuel, and you can get important chemicals out of peat as well.
Okay,
thanks. It also smells kind of bad, but it's a pretty interesting little thing. Comrade Angelo, did you want to respond? You're muted. Can you unmute?
So manure in peat. That's why it smells. Now, in the West, in our country, they built homes out of peat. They cut it into squares, and it looks like brick. And they would actually build a home in the Pleasant and the Plains out of peat moss.
Oh, I just wanted to answer the question about what peat is. It's a type of moss. It's called a sphagnum moss if you look it up. And yeah, it's very useful for a lot of different things. Mostly as fuel. And sphagnum bogs are really interesting because They have like a very acidic pH, and anything that falls in there gets like really well preserved. So it has a lot of really interesting chemical properties.
Yeah, more just a comment. Talking about that passage that said most of the people in Belarusia could not read or write. They had to take any of their letters to the priests. And I think that oftentimes that it really gets overlooked how important the literacy campaigns are for working class people, because, you know, a lot gets said about free speech and all that other type of stuff. But, you know, it's really hard to have free communication without the ability to communicate with one another. And literacy is a humongous part of free thought. So just to point that out.
If there are no other comments, we will move on to our next section now. The next section is going to be Belarus in the Great Patriotic War. So we're hitting the middle of the 20th century.
Belarus SSR in 1939. There's an excerpt by Stuart Parker. The non-aggression pact and the partition of Poland are controversial events. Anti-Soviet writers refer to the pact as an alliance, whereas the Soviet line, and the reality, is that it was purely a maneuver to gain time to prepare for the inevitable war with fascism. What is significant, however, is that the Red Army entered Poland after the Polish army was essentially defeated, and certainly did not split the Polish defense. Nor did the Red Army occupy any areas that were regarded as Polish before 1919. Indeed, the official reason given for the Red Army's entry was, quote, to protect the life and property of the population of West Ukraine and West Belarus, unquote. The arrival of the Red Army was greeted enthusiastically by most Western Belarusians, as they had lived under direct persecution in Poland, with around 10,000 Belarusians having been imprisoned during the 30s for belonging to communist groups. The Soviet authorities were quick to reunite Belarus and set about Sovietizing the western half too. At this time, the original border between the two halves remained closed, as each half was at markedly differing levels of development, plus the process of dekulakization and the rooting out of anti-Soviet elements in Western Belarus had not yet begun. Two groups had very different feelings on now coming under Soviet rule. Firstly, the Poles, who had been landowners and bosses, were now likely to feel the backlash of their government's nationalist policies. Secondly, the Jews of Western Belarus, who had been spared Nazi occupation. Jewish life was developing well in the USSR, with the establishment of a Jewish autonomous region near the Manchurian border in 1934. This autonomous region attracted Jews from across the Soviet Union, and even from around the world. However, Jewish life in the Belarusian towns was firmly established, and many Belarusian Jews remained in the USSR. The SSR, I mean to say. The people trapped behind German lines in Belarus were uncertain of what this new occupation would bring. The German occupation of 1916 to 1918 had been largely conducted in a decent and peaceable manner, certainly in contrast to the subsequent Polish invasion. However, it would soon become clear that the Germans were not to be benevolent or even passive liberators. The German plan for Belarus extended far beyond the military ones. Resettlement areas for the overpopulated German cities were to be in the east, specifically Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. Nazi racial doctors decreed that up to 25% of Belarusians may be of enough racial purity to be Germanized, quote unquote, while the remainder, some 7.5 million people, were to be destroyed. What was for certain was the fate of the large Belarusian Jewish population. At the end of July of 1941, as well as prisoner of war camps, POW camps, the Nazis established a Jewish ghetto in Minsk. This ghetto had over 100,000 inmates, and over the course of the year, large numbers of European Jews were resettled into this ghetto. The Minsk ghetto was headed by Yefim Stelovich. He recounted after the war that though the Germans did find individual collaborators, that, quote, they were the exception and not the rule. The dominant characteristic of the Belarusian population was one of friendship and sympathy towards the Jews, unquote. An example of the sentiment was seen on the 21st of July 1941, when the Germans roped a group of 45 Jews together in a pit and ordered 30 Belarusian prisoners of war to bury them alive. The prisoners of war refused, and subsequently the Germans shot all 75. Such a gesture, although futile, showed the results of the long history of cooperation in Belarus, coupled with the success of the communists' anti-racist education. This was in stark contrast to the overt anti-Semitism that was reported by the Germans in Polish, Baltic, and Ukrainian territories. However, the concrete bunkers gave the Germans the idea, which was to become policy, of using poison gas. 2 days later, in Mogilev, eastern Belarus, around 30 mental patients were successfully murdered when they were locked in a room into which car exhaust fumes were directed. As mentioned earlier, the German vision for Belarus did not limit genocide to the Jews, yet there was also to be Germanization. The Belarusian nationalists, ironically, seemed to be the most likely to be spared and fall into this category. Under the auspices of the Germans and the nationalists organized themselves into a Belarusian mutual aid society, which opened schools and established a paramilitary Belarusian defense corps. The nationalists used these organizations for anti-Soviet propaganda and began flying the white, red, white flag and displaying the Pahonia emblem. The collaborators, however, were very few, and occupation of Belarus was predominantly characterized by hostility and particularly by guerrilla warfare. The partisan movement sprang up sporadically throughout late 1941. The Communist Party of the Byelorussian SSR created a directive on the 1st of July concerning the development of partisan warfare in the rear of the enemy. 2 days later, Stalin addressed the nation in a speech broadcast to the whole of the USSR by radio, in which he said, quote, in the occupied region, conditions must be made unbearable for the enemy and all his accomplices. They must be bounded and annihilated at every step, and all their measures frustrated, unquote. Spontaneous partisan units did spring up. Many formed from the nuclei of isolated groups of soldiers cut off behind enemy lines by the speed of the German advance. Stalin wanted the partisan movement to be coordinated and needed the intelligence that they could supply. In order to achieve this, one of the better-known examples of German methods in Belarus is that of the village of Katyn. This village was burnt to the ground in 1944 by the German army. The villagers first being rounded up and locked in a church, and burnt to death along the entire village. Alexander Lukashenko described this ethnic murder in 2004 as being, quote, an unhealed wound in the heart of our motherland, unquote. The village of Katyn is just one example of what was a painfully clear message, that despite the propaganda of nationalists, the Germans felt no compassion for Belarusian statehood, or indeed the Belarusian people. Partisans in Belarus were hugely effective. They were able to make use of the vast Belarusian forests and marshes for concealment, and by 1943, there were 75,000 partisans active in Belarus, who controlled some 60% of the territory. In this same year, the partisans managed to assassinate the German General Commissar in charge of Belarusian territory, Wilhelm Kuba. By 1944, there were over 300,000 partisans fighting in Belarus, their numbers buoyed by the brutality of the German occupation and pending liberation. July 3rd, 1944 saw the Red Army force the Germans out of Minsk, and 25 days later, the frontier city of Brest was retaken. The liberation of Belarus had been carried out in a massive Soviet offensive codenamed Bagration, which combined the efforts of more than 1.7 million Soviet troops, together with the partisans of Belarus. Soviet troops captured Berlin, and Germany unconditionally surrendered following Hitler's suicide on the 3rd of May, 1945.
We will now go to our next discussion round.
Yeah, just a little note on the Nazi collaborationist government. They were still in effect, in existence until at least the 90s. Here on the northeast of the U.S., they operated in exile out of a town in New Jersey called South River, and they have a notorious monument to the Nazi collaborator war criminals in the cemetery there.
Interesting. The things I want to say about it, I cannot say here on camera. So,
yeah, I just wanted to mention that there is a Soviet movie called Come and See that is about the Nazi occupation of Belarus. Specifically, it's a very graphic movie and requires an extremely strong stomach. So I want to caution everyone. But it does, for example, show a scene where there's a church burning, like you mentioned, and I think it's a very effective kind of emotional tool to kind of get across a little bit of the horror that was involved in that. But like I said, it's something to approach with caution. But very good movie for that, for kind of a historic aspect.
thank you, Comrade Vinny. Actually, we have shown that movie here in the past, and while it may not be so ideological, it is definitely very descriptive and graphic about the Nazi occupation and brutality. It's also kind of interesting in that for Soviet films, it was actually made in the mid-'80s by a Belarusian production company. So it's kind of got a bit of a different bent to it than some of the other Soviet films of the time. Overall, it's a really good movie, but it's a little different from some of the others.
Yeah, just a note on that movie. One thing that I really appreciate about that movie is it completely destroys the myth that the Nazis were this elite fighting force, that they were very disciplined. You watch that movie and you see they're like animals. They're barbaric. So that's one good thing about it. It definitely dismantles this prevalent idea in the US even. I've watched a lot of movies to do with World War II from the US, and they've always propped the Germans up as like very disciplined.
I'd say disciplined, and they're sticking to the amphetamine schedule, but that's another topic. Alrighty, if there are no other comments or questions, we'll head to our last section, which is a little longer than the others, but this is post-1991 Belarus. This will also cover a little bit of the Cold War period and some of the Western myths about Belarus.
Belarus during the Cold War. When the United Nations was formed, the Byelorussian and Ukrainian SSRs were given seats at the United Nations General Assembly. Part of this was due to Stalin, who said it was because of the devastation they suffered and their input into beating Nazi Germany. Partisans in Belarus had killed, captured, or wounded over 500,000 Nazis, while Nazi casualties for both their African and Italian campaigns totaled only 411,000. Belarus had to reindustrialize due to the devastation and began the process anew, which was completed by the 1950s. Collectivization was completed in 1952. The first secretary of the Byelorussian Communist Party was Peter Masharov, regarded to be Masarov's leading protege. Masharov was another prominent former partisan with an impressive war record. formerly a school teacher, Masharov had taken to the woods following the German invasion and established an active partisan group. Masharov was loyal to the Soviet cause and was awarded the highest award of the state, the title Hero of the Soviet Union in 1944. The Masharov era from 1965 until his death in 1980 is regarded as being a time of great growth and prosperity in Belarus. Masharov was a truly popular leader. Belarus in the Cold War. The drive toward creating a Soviet mindset and not a national one was particularly successful in Belarus. The leadership, predominantly from the wartime partisans, were easily able to illustrate the connection between nationalism and the crimes of the Nazis and their collaborators. Coupled to this, the 1933 language reform had contributed to the creation of a Russified Belarusian national character. National pride in Belarus was overwhelmingly a pride in Soviet Belarus and its recent achievements. Whilst the Ukrainians and Russians had their folk heroes, generals, and Cossacks, the Belarusians had the partisans and living examples to revere, such as their athletes and cosmonauts. In an official guide to the BSSR, the Belarusian national character was described as being courage and staunchness, modesty and industry, and keen sense of internationalist duty. These are typical Soviet-era values and ideals found in most propaganda information books of the time. Masharov was a committed communist, and as head of the Belarusian party apparatus, he worked so hard that in the Brezhnev administration, there was concern that he may even be a nationalist. This concern, however, was unfounded, and his hardline approach to Soviet policy illustrates this. For example, he was opposed to the peaceful coexistence and detente foreign policies regarding the struggle against imperialism and capitalism as being no area for compromise. As the Brezhnev era reached its twilight years, the stagnation in Soviet development had slowly led to an increase in corruption amongst the party officials. Masharov was an exception to this. He was honest and direct, and his popularity with the Soviet and particularly Belarusian people stemmed from this. In 1980, Masharov published his book, Soviet Belarus, in which he openly criticized the arrogant and conceited party leadership. His criticism was carefully worded along Marxist-Leninist principles and showed his loyalty to the cause, but not to Brezhnev. Peter Masharov died in October 1980 when his car collided with a truck, despite having a police escort. His unexpected death and the unusual circumstances created rumors that Masharov was a potential candidate for leadership of the USSR and that his death was a KGB operation to keep the ruling clique in power.
Belarus, 1990s. On the 27th of July, 1990, the BSSR declared independence from what was left of the USSR. The Communist Party was still the dominant faction in the Supreme Soviet, and the Republic still retained its Soviet system. This, however, changed a year later, following the disastrous attempted coup in Moscow by communists, hoping to preserve Soviet government and restore the Soviet Union. Belarus saw mass demonstrations against the political violence in Russia, but as the final nail in the Soviet coffin, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as the leader of the Communist Party, and his final decree in August 1991 was to declare a suspension of all Communist Party activity. Following Gorbachev's lead, Belarusian Prime Minister Vyacheslav Kebich officially suspended the Communist Party of Belarus on August the 28th, 1991. This left Belarus in a political limbo. Whilst neighboring republics simply broke away and declared themselves independent, Belarus still functioned as a Soviet Socialist Republic. An extraordinary session of the Supreme Soviet of Belarus was held on September the 17th, lasting 2 days, and resulted in the promotion of Shushkevich to Chairman Speaker of the Parliament and a full proclamation of independence. Going it alone was a hard option for most of the republics. In an attempt to protect each new nation from total economic collapse, a new union was created, this time called the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. The CIS was created in Belarus at a country house in Byelorussian. The chief architects of this Commonwealth were the Russian President Boris Yeltsin, Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, with Stanislav Shushkevich representing Belarus. The Byelorussian Accords could only officially declare the end of the Soviet Union after each of the constituent governments had voted to adopt them. The vote in Belarus was all but unanimous, with only one member of the Belarusian parliament voting against the final dissolution of the Soviet Union. That one member was Alexander Lukashenko.
And there's a picture of him in the 90s. Still got the mustache, a little younger looking, but
Belarus transformed very little between 1991 and 1994, as the Soviet system was not practically replaced by anything else. Belarus had no equivalent of Boris Yeltsin, willing to bully and fight anything and anyone who stood in the way of his reforms. Belarus was also one of the most militarized areas in Europe, with thousands of Soviet army troops stationed there, as well as nuclear weapons. This military presence led some stability to the republic, but also represented logistical problems in terms of allowing troops to return home and feeding and housing them whilst they were in Belarus. Lukashenko won the presidency in 1994, due in part for his record as a fighter of corruption, but far more for what he believed in and promised. Whilst other politicians were talking about what they could change, Lukashenko was stressing what elements needed to be preserved. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union may have disintegrated, but its core principles and ideals have not. That does not mean that Lukashenko declared the intention to restore communism in Belarus, because he was more than aware that the circumstances had changed. The end of the Soviet Union and communist bloc in Eastern Europe was so cataclysmic for the nations involved that some change was going to be necessary for survival. The program of something, and then we go to Lukashenko himself acknowledged that it was the people themselves who had upheld the principle of social justice and did not vote for aggressive nationalism, but for historically shaped bilingualism. The notion that Lukashenko is forcing the Russian language on a nation who already predominantly spoke it, or that he maintains unjust control over the economy in order to pump money into the education and health sectors in a country where very few could afford to pay for these services, is ridiculous. Yet just these pretexts have been used as a basis for intervention by the rich and powerful against the poor and the weak. The economic direction pursued by Lukashenko is a direct legacy of the Soviet Union. The profit from state-run enterprises are not solely used to reward the directors, but is channeled back into the state coffers and divided up amongst the country through the social fund and government investment. Hence, the popularity with the Belarusian people of the socially orientated market economy. Social policy in the Soviet Union was a guarantee of coverage from the cradle to the grave, and as such was a positive experience for the people of Belarus. This historical element is preserved by Lukashenko, and though Belarusians are not rich in dollar terms, they certainly get a fair deal for the work they do. As the economy grows, so does the quality of life for all in the country. And this is where the dictatorship issue comes in. Lukashenko is only a dictator in terms of the economy. He will not sell off lucrative enterprises and land to foreign investors because Belarusians not only need the revenue more, but also because in the 1996 referendum, he promised not to. So this leads us neatly to the Belarusian opposition. The so-called democratic forces use anything but democratic methods and have become an industry all of their own. For many, being in the opposition is simply too lucrative to actually want to see an end to Lukashenko. Independent Western media has for the most part proved itself no more objective or impartial than the worst examples of state-owned propaganda from history. Whilst U.S. interference in Belarus has been excessive, unsubtle, and mismanaged. Apart from the provisions of the Belarus Democracy Act, it is also particularly dubious from a legal point of view. Under international law, more so. But then the U.S. attitude to international law has been practically one of contempt. Further, to the attempted destabilization of the internal situation in Belarus, the U.S. military has recently installed missile bases on the territory of Poland and the Czech Republic, seen both as a defense against and a threat to Belarus and its Russian neighbor.
And that's the modern flag of Belarus right there on the right.
The attempted color revolution of the 2020s, Minsk, October 7th. Belarus has experienced at attempt of a color revolution. Dusan Perokovic, head of the Center for Eurasian Studies at the Institute of International Politics and Economics, said, "A color revolution needs a direct convergence of external factors. This activity is coordinated and financed from abroad. In addition to that, color revolutions always pursue political goals. It was the case in Ukraine and Georgia, the Arab Spring. Naturally, the same was in Belarus," Dusan Berorikov said. The expert added, "The reaction of the European Union and the United States proves that they had had a very clear idea of what they had wanted from Belarus even before the election was held. There should be no dilemmas about this. There was an attempt of a color revolution in Belarus."
A couple of notes. One, you see that flag being flown on the right there. Does that flag look familiar? Where have we seen that flag before? Also, the Belarus Democracy Act was an act passed by Congress starting back in 2004 and has been renewed up since, that basically says the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, done in New York in 1966, guaranteeing Belarusians freedom of expression and freedom of associations, and Alexander Lukashenko has ruled Belarusian in an undemocratic dictatorship since the first presidential election in 1944. And subsequent presidential elections have neither been free nor fair, blah, 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 and basically passed under George W. Bush to basically promote democracy in Belarus. And you can take away what that means. So we will now go to our final discussion round.
Yeah, in the reading for this section, it talked about so-called stagnation in the Brezhnev period in the Soviet Union. It's important to point out that there's a narrative about stagnation, but as I understand it, that's not really the reality of the period. The growth during the Brezhnev era in the 70s and the early 80s was not at the par of what had been in the past, say under Stalin, but there was still growth. It was not stagnation like we tend to hear in the West. And that whole narrative about stagnation was actually used during the Gorbachev era as a means of promoting reform. Gorbachev used the idea of stagnation to say we need to reform. So just be careful about that.
Thank you, Comrade Joe. Yeah, I had a bit of an issue with some of the narratives that were put by Stuart Parker in his book. For one, he also referred to Belarus was briefly independent in 1918, referring to the nationalist Belarusian People's Republic, with no mention of the Belarusian Soviet Republic. And never mind that all the republics of the USSR Constitution of 1922 were independent and equal in union. With no mention of that. So there are some things where he's definitely got a more liberal perspective on things. But I did think some of his later 90s analysis in Belarus was pretty insightful, minus whatever other views he may have. So
yeah, for the most part, I thought that it was a good reading. I was a little bit concerned with the spot where it said that, after the Communist Party was banned and Lukashenko took power, he did nothing to try and bring back communism in Belarus, and it kind of accepted it as almost like the end of history narrative that communism was obsolete after that. So it was it was a mixed reading, but I think in general it played a positive role.
thank you. Lukashenko was kind of interesting in that he was a party member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but he was never actually in the Belarusian Communist Party, that section. So he's kind of got a little bit of an interesting position nowadays, whereas the Communist Party of Belarus is still very large and active, but Lukashenko is technically not a member of that party.
Yeah, maybe it was the wording of the text. I know it's hard to find good material on this for things that have happened after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it said there, I can't remember exactly, that the people accepted social justice or something along those lines. And that definitely, sorry, go for it.
Yeah, so Lukashenko said that the people themselves who had upheld the principle of social justice and not vote for aggressive nationalism, but for historically shaped bilingualism. And this was referring to some of the rumors that, Lukashenko pushed the Russian language on Belarus to kind of force Belarus to be another satellite or appendage of the Russian Federation at this point.
Right, but
he's like, the author was also saying, Belarus was already 90% speaking Russian by the time the Soviet Union broke apart. So
was there some, it's hard to say because it was the fall of the Soviet Union, some right-wing opportunism by Lukashenko in all of this, say that, he didn't really, like you said, he didn't join the Belarusian Communist Party. It seemed like he kind of went down a social democratic route after that. And he really did not fight to, I don't know if we could say that Belarus is a communist society or more of a Venezuelan type of social democratic society. I don't know. I'm curious what others think too, but
I'd say it's probably a little maybe towards the latter. One exception, though, was when the USSR fell apart, a lot of the state-run industries and other properties were very quickly sold off to multinational companies and foreign peoples on the pennies. Belarus was one of the few areas where this did not really happen. The Belarusian state kept control of most of its state-run industries, so they've been able to at least continue with a lot of the prior policies. Another interesting thing was we had the prior section on Pyotr Mashevrov. So both him and Mazarov, who was his predecessor, while people like Khrushchev, who ran the Ukrainian Communist Party, had kind of hung back from the front lines, both Mazarov and Masharov had been partisans that had led units fighting the Nazis, and they became party leaders during the Cold War. And there was always, as best I could tell, within the Communist Party of the Belarusian Communist Party, there was people who remembered the Great Patriotic War and were actually good Marxist-Leninists, compared to some of the others that seemed like they were more some of the either intellectuals or the opportunists that had kind of hung around in the back. So again, I really think we could have a whole nother class on this because there's just so much information I was able to squeeze in this, and there's still so much more missing.
I don't think like it's fair to say that that Lukashenko accepted the end of history. Like I from my reading, I assume that he like did the best. He was just like accepted that it was difficult. It would be difficult to like to Belarus to revive like the Soviet system by itself without the support of Russia and everything. And he did the best to preserve as much of the Soviet social programs and everything as he could. Thanks.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious too. So Belarus, as it pertains to the post-Soviet collapse, or so we have Cuba, Belarus, and the DPRK. That is, out of the three, if I'm missing one, that is, which one ranks the best? Which came out of the post-Soviet era the most? You would say, ideologically, maybe even politically and economically, if anybody has that.
That's really hard to say because you could argue that maybe perhaps North Korea maybe have came out ideologically best, but the collapse of the USSR was horrible there, where they lost their major trading partner and then a collapse in infrastructure caused a famine. Belarus was still quite landlocked, so it was still very dependent on its neighbors for trade and whatnot.
I was going to mention that Eritrea, they call it like it's called the DPRK of Africa or whatever, because it's like they have like strict restrictions on travel and stuff. But if you go on their website, they consider themselves fully socialist. Well, not fully socialist. They consider themselves socialist. And I mean, they have the same, it's like Belarus. They have nationalized like oil, free healthcare, and housing and stuff. But Eritrea is one most people don't talk about. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they basically reformed their part. Like in Africa, pretty much all the parties changed their ideology from Marxism-Leninism to some version of like just Marxism. But that's one that people don't talk about a lot.
Whenever we're talking about Lukashenko and stuff like that, I think that sometimes we can be a little bit idealist with how we view these leaders. You know, if he's left as the only one, like, what is he supposed to do? If he comes out as an outright communist, joins the Communist Party, does all that, then he's really openly declaring himself an enemy. You know, you're talking about having to exist as, you know, the leader of the socialist, or you still have the ideals of socialism. You know, it makes it really difficult for people in a post-USSR society. And I would have to say, you know, just to Ambrose's question, I feel like maybe the DPRK came out the best just because they still have the political Leninist formation, you know, like, so they still have the institutions of Marxism-Leninism that keep their government sovereign and strong.
Also around this time, Yugoslavia very quickly happened after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and that very well could have happened in Belarusia.
Yeah, I was I was just kind of curious how the the circumstances of reinstating the Communist Party activities. I saw that the current Communist Party of Belarus was formed in 1996. I was just curious how that happened, and also does it have its close connections with its history?
There's two. I believe there's two parties actually in Belarus. One considers himself anti-revisionist, and one of them is like kind of like Euro-communist. I don't know how much they revere their history a lot, actually. At least the anti-revisionist one does, and both of the communist parties are actually in the government with Lukashenko. They have a good amount of seats, so they still have influence on society. Children of communists and stuff that they look to the past, and I don't think we should be idealistic about countries like China and Vietnam, ones that took the market socialist way. Because of the collapse of the USSR, they had to do what they had to do. But a lot of people want, they're so anti-revisionist in their mind that they end up not supporting a country because of something like that. And I'm not a dangist at all. I don't want market socialism in the United States, but we shouldn't be too critical of them, at least not right now. And I mean, they have their plans laid out. Like, I think we should just see how it plays out. Right now, China can't really nationalize everything. They're not strong enough. But eventually, they're going to nationalize all of the U.S. Owned companies. I mean, that's what they plan to do, at least. I don't know why American companies keep investing when this is openly their strategy.
You think there's places in America to invest in? Not the biggest market in the world.
Yeah.
Oh well. Anyway, before we end for tonight and go to announcements and discussions, Comrade Angelo, I know you visited Minsk in the 1970s. Would you like to give your perspective of what the city was like and your perspective on Belarus?
Okay. In 76, I was there for a couple of months. And Belarus was the only Soviet city that had no architectural charm. The only one. The whole thing was destroyed. Minsk was destroyed. Only one church remained from World War II. So they had to build quickly. So they built these cement buildings, square-looking cement buildings that had no architecture at all. The only big Soviet city that happened to. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. And with that, the time is now 9:23 Eastern, so we will go to our wrap-up and announcement slides. New Outlook Publishers is our sister publishing house, and this slide has not been updated. I do apologize for that, but I will turn the floor over to Comrade.
Yes, please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers. You can purchase a lot of great works at New Outlook Publishers and help support the school. As I announced last week, our latest release was the October Revolution from Stalin, and the October Revolution, as well as Communism versus Fascism that you see here, will be upcoming classes in the fall syllabus. And please purchase these books and help support the school, and it'll get you prepared for when we have those classes later on. And once again, the website is newoutlookpublishers.store.
We'll close tonight with the Internationale in Belarusian.